Oh, that's the PowerPoint for tonight, Ken. No PowerPoint for this morning. 1 Peter chapter 2 is where we'll be. And now you know where we'll be tonight. But 1 Peter chapter 2 will be our text for this morning. While you're turning there, I want to revisit an Old Testament story with you from the book of Genesis. You might remember that God had promised to Abram that he would make of Abram a great nation, that Abram's descendants would be as countless as the stars in the sky. Well, God promised that to Abram, and then the years passed. And as the decades kept going, the promise seemed to have stalled. And Sarai, Abram's wife, came up with an idea. She suggested to Abram, look, this isn't happening for us. What if you take my servant Hagar, and maybe we can build a family through her? So Abram agrees, and they do that, and Hagar is pregnant. But what was supposed to become a solution for their family becomes the beginning of a household war, because Hagar is now carrying the chosen child, the promised son. And she has this pride that she's walking around the house with. And Sarai has this envy and jealousy of Hagar that she's walking around the house with. So Sarai is mistreating Hagar, and eventually Hagar flees. She runs off into the wilderness. Now, if you're keeping score at home, what that means is that a young foreign servant girl has just fled off into the wilderness with no home, no family, no promise of the future, and now she's out here in the wilderness and she's alone. And it's at that moment, by a spring of water, when an angel of the Lord finds her. He doesn't just stumble across her, he finds her. And he speaks comforting words to her. He promises that her son, Ishmael, would also become a great nation like Isaac, the son of Abram. And it's at that point, after this conversation where Hagar's been comforted and she's returning back to Abram and to the family, she does something that no one else in the Bible does. She gives God a name. She calls him El Roi, which is the God who sees me, in Genesis 16 and verse 13. The God who sees me. I want you to hold on to that as we read from 1 Peter chapter 2 this morning, because Peter is writing to Christians who, much like Hagar, know what it's like to suffer unjustly, to suffer invisibly, where it feels like no one else even knows what you're going through. And Peter tells them that the same God who saw Hagar sees them. But even more than just seeing them, this same God also suffers for them and with them. I want us to read together verses 18 through 25 of 1 Peter 2 this morning as we begin. Peter says, "Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing, when, mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if, when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, so that you might follow in his steps. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls." This is where we'll be meditating this morning, but I want you to notice, first of all, the people to whom Peter is writing. Verse 18 begins with the word servants, slaves in their culture. So Peter isn't writing, first of all, to preachers, to professors, to scholars. He's writing to servants, to households, to Christians who know what it's like to suffer unfairly. Now, you also know what that's like. For us, it's not always these dramatic catastrophes of life. Most of the time, it's just the small, grueling injustices of ordinary life. It's a student who is bullied in school for their integrity and not cheating on a test and not going to the party, whatever it is. It's the employee who's passed over for that promotion because they have more faith and family commitments than the person whose entire life is their work. It's the spouse who's scoffed at for their Christ-like commitment and gentleness and meekness and compassion and is made to feel lesser than by their spouse who doesn't share those same qualities. It's things like that, just the basic wrongs of everyday life. Now, when we are wronged, there are three common reactions that come out of us. The first one is retaliation. We want the person who wronged us to suffer a blow, at least an equal blow to the one that we were dealt. We want revenge. The second is withdrawal, that we despair. We shrink away from whatever is causing us the pain. We shrink, we turn into smaller versions of ourselves, and we just wait for it to pass. Maybe we vent. Maybe we hide away somewhere, but whatever it is, we're despairing. And the third reaction is that we harden ourselves. We build walls between us and the outside world, between us and even our inner selves. We build walls. We become brittle. We become bitter, stubborn. We don't trust anyone. We harden ourselves. Now, all three of those responses, retaliation and withdrawing and hardening, all three of those responses make sense to us. They're working hard to keep us safe. But they also contribute to furthering the cycle that we find ourselves in, to furthering the world's economy of injury, that the pain that's caused to us, we then cause to ourselves even more so, and to the people around us. It doesn't open the door to healing. And Peter refuses to leave us there. He refuses to leave us in those cycles of suffering. He says in verse 19 that it's a gracious thing when mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. Now, we could translate the beginning of this verse maybe a bit more literally to say, this is a grace. It is a grace, a gift, when you suffer unfairly. That is not how I think. I have never suffered unfairly and just automatically thought, you know what? This is a gift to my life right now. I'm so happy this is happening to me. This is good for me. I don't think like that. You probably don't either. But Peter says it's a grace. It's a gift. Why? Well, it's in verse 20. He says, what credit is it if, when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? Now, the second half of verse 20, what we're about to read, is really the point of this whole section. But if, when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing, a grace, in the sight of God. It's a grace. We think of grace as a warm and fuzzy word, and rightfully so, right? It's unmerited favor. It's a good thing. But there's nothing warm and fuzzy about, for these slaves, being beaten for their master, specifically because they did the right thing. But that's what Peter calls a grace, a gift. Now that's strange. That's not how I see the world. But notice that the emphasis here isn't on my perspective, it's on God's, because it ends, the verse ends, verse 20, it's a gracious thing in the sight of God. In verse 19, Peter tells us to be mindful of God. And he tells us that because of verse 20, I think, that God is mindful of us, that God sees, that our God, as Hagar said, is the God who sees me, who sees you. Now, it doesn't always feel that way. When you're a parent who's trying to do right by your kids, but it's just so hard, and the days pass and it just doesn't seem to get any easier. When you are a student whose grades are lagging behind because you won't cheat like so many of your classmates do on the test to help you get ahead. When you are a good, a kind, a caring person, but you get that diagnosis, does that feel like grace? Do you feel seen in that moment? Not with these eyes. Not with the eyes of mine, the way I see the world. But Peter does something surprising here, and maybe even annoying or dispiriting to you. He turns from those issues, from the real life, the relevant, the practical things, and he devolves into church talk. He turns to the cross. And he points us to Jesus, And not just to any moment in Jesus' life, but maybe to the most horrific, painful moment of Jesus' life, the moment of the cross. He points us to a cruciform moment. Now that word cruciform, it's not a word that we use really ever at all, but it's pretty simple. It just means in the shape of a cross, in the form of a crucifixion, cruciform, in the shape of a cross. And Peter says that cruciform moment says something for us right here and right now in the little grinding injustices of our daily lives and the big fat injustices that still exist in our world. He says that cruciform moment means something for us. He says in verse 21, "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example, that you might follow in his steps." And this language that he uses here, he committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. And when he was reviled, he didn't revile in return. When he suffered, he didn't threaten, but continued entrusting himself to the one who judges justly. That language is referring to what we think of as the trial, the crucifixion, the death of Jesus. He says that he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, on the cross, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. It's almost like Peter looks out at the world. In verse 18, he looks at these servants, and he sees that the world isn't as it should be. We look out in our world, in our lives, and we see that the world isn't right. The world isn't as it should be. And Peter doesn't deny that, but he offers us something else. It's almost like he holds out a pair of 3D glasses. He invites us to put them on. I don't know if you've ever been to a movie that you saw in 3D. It's a different experience than a regular movie, right? Because if you're just watching the movie without those glasses, the 3D movie without the 3D glasses, it doesn't make sense. You can't really see anything. Everything is blurry. But when you put the glasses on, it's kind of crazy because all of a sudden you can see an entirely different dimension, right? It's not just on the screen. There's something else happening. There's an entirely different thing happening. And Peter here offers us some 3D glasses. He invites us to put them on and to look at our lives from a different perspective, a cruciform perspective. He invites us to put on these glasses to see the cruciform dimension of regular life that's shaped like a cross. That's what he invites us to. And that may feel a little far away from you, out of touch with your life. After all, we're talking about a singular event that happened 2,000 years ago on the complete other side of the planet, and no one involved, including Peter, had ever even heard of McDonald's, right? They are totally different, totally separate from our lives. But I think what Peter might say is that moment, that particular moment, he said, maybe I don't understand anything else about you, and I don't understand what these cars are and everything, but this moment, I believe, is relevant to your life. This cross, this cruciform moment is actually incredibly relevant to all of your problems. He says in the end of verse 24, where we cut off, "By his wounds you have been healed." That's what we want. We want healing. And what happens on that tree, on that cross, is that our wounds, the very marks of the violence and significance of our world, are remastered. That God himself enters into our suffering and re-signifies it, that his wounds heal us. And that means that our wounds are not meaningless. That our griefs, our scars, our injuries, just from this life, mean something. They're part of a bigger story. They can become a testimony to the same God who heals us. The fact that he heals the world through these wounds. And again, maybe this feels too good to be true. It is church talk, after all. And many of us gave up on healing a long time ago. You have scars of childhood, scars of parenting, scars of marriage, scars of church, scars of work, of school, of grief. You have scars. And many of us gave up on any of those scars healing a long time ago. And now you have a young whippersnapper up here talking to you about healing. And what do I know? Maybe not very much. But I do think that you and I share something in common that's really important here. We're called. Peter says, "To this you have been called." Now, we think about calling, and we think of picking up the phone and calling someone, right? And it's connected to this, but it's also a bit different. It refers, first of all, to Peter's call. In the Gospels, Jesus goes to these people, these regular people like you and me, and he says, "Follow me." He says that to Peter, "Follow me." That's Peter's call. So that's the most basic meaning. But as the Jesus movement matures, moves on, that same word, to call, comes to mean something deeper, something bigger, something that involves you and me. Because Jesus says, "I came not to call the righteous, but sinners." Now that's you and me, fellow sinners. He came to call us. "Follow me," he says. And so Peter calls on this language of calling, and he tells us that this is our calling, to walk in the footsteps of Jesus. And where do those footsteps lead? If you follow Jesus' life, those footsteps lead to a cross. And so Peter writes to these suffering servants, these suffering slaves, and he says, "Take up that cross and follow him." As Jesus himself said, "Take up your cross daily and follow me." Now, in our lives, it's not always as dramatic as it sounds, as dramatic as a real-life crucifixion is. In fact, most of the time, it's not. But if we put on those 3D glasses, I think we might just see a cruciform reality that's present in church, in our homes, in our schools, in our jobs, in the grocery store, on the highway, in our grief. We might just find a cruciform dimension there waiting for us because we are called. We are called to see life differently. And that means that we have a purpose. We have a direction. We have someone on the other end of the phone. We're called. Now, crucifixion, dying on a cross, was under Roman law reserved for slaves. This was the death of a slave. And like what happened with Jesus, oftentimes with crucifixion tagged along scourging, torture. It's a really terrible way to die. But when you read ancient documents, they talk about the pain of it all. But most of all, they talk about the shame. And this is what the gospel writers do, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They mention the facts of the crucifixion, the pain that Jesus endured, but all of them mention the shame. In Hebrews 12 and verse 2, it says that Jesus endured the cross, despising the shame, not the pain, despising the shame. Now that's interesting, because if you're me, I'm despising the pain, right? If you've ever known anything about what a crucifixion is, the pain is what's standing out to me. But what stands out to them is the shame. And if you've suffered in a particular way, you might know that oftentimes that can be the worst part, the shame of it all. Depending on what type of suffering it is, you can have these voices in your head that tell you that you'll never be the same. You'll never be whole. You'll never be healed. That people look at you differently, that you're marked. You feel like Hagar, just out in the wilderness, running away from your own Sarai, needing your own miracle. That's how it can feel. How the shame of the cross can feel, the mental scars. But the cross speaks to us over those voices, and it says, "To this you have been called, to suffer with Christ." And this suffering isn't actually evidence that you've been abandoned by God. It's actually evidence that you've been called by God. Now, it's important to say that with all of this, this is not meant to glorify or excuse or desire something that's wrong in the world, something that's unjust or abusive or oppressive. That's not the point of this. And if you find yourself in a life-threatening or deeply abusive situation this morning, I hope that this text might provide a glimmer of hope. I hope that you also can find some help this morning. But mainly, my aim is just those small things that happen on a daily basis where something is wrong with our world and we feel it. And I think that this cruciform moment means something for us in those moments. Because we also, like Jesus here, can entrust ourselves to the one who judges justly. Now, this is not a resignation that nothing can be done, that the system always wins, so why even try at all? It's not that. It's actually an active confidence that this is not the end of the story. That whatever evil is happening in my life, in your life, that it doesn't get the last word. Jesus, as he's on the cross, remember that he calls out, "Father, forgive them. the people who were crucifying him, forgive them, because they don't know what they're doing. So this entrusting to God, it's not mainly a vengeful trust that we hope that God will condemn our enemies. It's a hope for mercy, not condemnation, but redemption. Forgive them. Find some glimmer of hope in them, in this person, whoever it is who knowingly or unknowingly is doing something wrong in my life. You might have heard of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who there was a movie made about him, I think last year maybe. But he was a German minister back in the 1930s. And he, if you are connecting the dots here, this was when Hitler's rise was happening, and Bonhoeffer opposed Hitler. And eventually, he was imprisoned because of this. And I want to take you to April 8th, 1945. It was a Sunday morning, much like this one. And it was also the second to last day of Bonhoeffer's life. He, again, had been imprisoned. At this point, World War II is almost over. Hitler himself will die fairly soon. The Allies are just days away from liberating the region where Bonhoeffer is. But he knows that there's no liberation for him because Hitler has specifically demanded that Bonhoeffer be executed. So no matter what's happening around him, he is going to die. So this is the second to last day of his life. And the guards in this prison allow him, he's in the Flossenburg concentration camp, and they allow him on this Sunday morning to lead a worship service in the camp. Now their auditorium was had very little in common with this one. It was just a cold, bare schoolroom, and they didn't have pulpits or pews or hymnals. It was just prisoners. And Bonhoeffer led this congregation, which was made up of some British officers, some German resistors, people from different backgrounds with different languages, all wearing prison rags, and he leads them in this worship service. And the Old Testament text for his sermon that morning was Isaiah 53 and verse 5, which Peter quotes here at the end of verse 24, because Isaiah 53 verse 5 says that by his wounds we're healed. That's the Old Testament text. The New Testament text is 1 Peter 1 and verse 3, which says that we are born again to a living hope. And almost certainly, Bonhoeffer referenced our text here in 1 Peter 2, one of his favorite texts in the Bible, as it's referenced in Isaiah 53, almost certainly brought the connection to 1 Peter 2. But we don't know all that he said. But we know from witnesses who survived and remembered the gist, the heart of what he said. His sermon was about how the death of Jesus isn't just proof that he loves us. It is that. But it's also more than that. Because his death is actually the very means by which God redeems the world. That his suffering brings about healing. And that the people who belong to him are called to follow the same path, not grasping for power in the way that Hitler did, not grasping for power, trying to run over our enemies, but embracing a cruciform path, embracing that the footsteps that we're following might just lead to a cross. After the sermon was over, the guards came in and they asked Bonhoeffer to come with them, and everyone knew what was happening. Bonhoeffer turned to a fellow prisoner, a British captain, and he said these words to him quietly before he got let off. He said, "This is the end. For me, the beginning of life." This is the end. For me, the beginning of life. The next morning, on April 9th of 1945, Bonhoeffer was hanged. So that's the end. But for him, the beginning of life. A doctor who was there later testified that the faith, the dignity that Bonhoeffer died with made a strong impression even on his executioners. That for him, he was being born again. It was a new life. Now, what's powerful about all of that to me is that Bonhoeffer's death wasn't just a tragedy. It was that. But it was also an imitation of 1 Peter 2. He was following in the steps of Jesus. He followed Jesus to death. And because of that, his suffering became a sermon. It redeemed the moment for the people who were there. It bore witness to a kingdom that couldn't be touched by that hangman's rope, right? It was a sermon. It said something deeper about life. And hopefully none of us face a trial like that particular one. But in our own smaller trials, we're called to do the same, to meet the unfairnesses of our world with the calm confidence of Christ. Because of him, we don't have to withdraw, we don't have to retaliate, we don't have to despair. Because of him, death, maybe the biggest bully of them all, is just an intermission. And a play isn't over at intermission, right? That's all death is for us. It's not the end of the story. Reality keeps on going. 1 Peter 2 ends with verse 25. You were straying like sheep, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Shepherd and overseer. I love those two images. They're both protective images. A shepherd, an overseer, a protector. He protects us. Christ, in other words, not those masters of 1 Peter 2, not the emperor of their world, not even death himself, has authority over his people, over you and me, or even over Peter. You know, if you know much about Peter's life, Peter would one day suffer and, as tradition says, be martyred for his faith. After his death, Clement, who is another early Christian, is writing about Peter, and he says that because of unrighteous jealousy, Peter endured, it's the same Greek word as 1 Peter 2 actually, endured not one or two, but many trials, and thus, having given his testimony, went to his appointed place of glory. That's 1 Clement 5 and verse 4. The tradition is that Peter was crucified, but that he wasn't worthy, he said, to be crucified in the same way that Jesus was, so he was crucified upside down. That's the tradition. We don't know if that actually happened, but it's been around for a long time. But regardless of how Peter died, it seems that he really believed this. He really believed that no matter the injustices that we face, whether it's small or whether it's a big old injustice like him being murdered for his faith, that those wounds are actually the way that God brings healing to our world. That God heals our world today through Jesus' wounds and through even our own wounds, if we can be so bold. That God uses the places where we hurt as places of mercy for the people around us. That he can use our weakness to be strong. As Paul said, I will boast all the more gladly in my weaknesses, because when I'm weak, he's strong. That his grace is sufficient for us, that his power is made perfect in weakness. And I don't know about you, but I have some weaknesses. If you do too, and you need to give your life to Christ this morning, won't you do that as we stand and sing together?
I hear the Savior say,